So here we go. We're going to talk about this, looking at it algebraically, right? Graphically, it's pretty easy to see it. Algebraically, it's a little bit trickier, but it's the same thing: domain, range, input, output. And what we're going to think about is what are we not allowed to plug in, right? We're going to think about what is not allowed to go into that equation. So let's do one of our linear equations. If we do f of x equals 3x plus 2, I think most of you realize that there are no x values that I'm not allowed to plug into this, right? I can plug in every x value and it'll be fine. I can plug in 0 and I'll get an answer of 2. I can plug in 100 and I'll get an answer of 302. I can plug in negative 5,000 and I would get an answer of negative 14,998. Doesn't matter, right? I can plug in all numbers. So the domain is everything, right? And in math, instead of saying it's everything, we say it's all real numbers. Or we can shorthand it and say it's all real numbers with that fancy R. This is just a fancy R. Okay? So that one's pretty easy. Linear equations, you can always plug in everything. It's when there's other things that we're not allowed to do, right? We are not allowed to ever divide by 0. So if I had this equation, right, x can't be 0 because I'm not allowed to divide by 0. So we can say x can't be 0. That's my domain. Every other number is okay, but x can't be 0 because then we'd be dividing by 0 and that's no good. What about this? Right? If we have the equation f of x equals 1 over x plus 3, well, we're not allowed to divide by 0, so what makes the denominator 0? X would be negative 3. We're not allowed to do that, right? So we say x cannot be negative 3. Okay, let's try one more. Okay, when we have x plus 5 divided by x minus 7. We're not allowed to divide by 0, right? So the numerator doesn't matter at all. We only care that we don't divide by 0. So x can't be positive 7, because if this is positive 7, then the denominator becomes 0, and that's no good. The numerator doesn't matter if it's 0 or not, so we can just ignore it. So we just say x can't be positive 7. Okay? So that's one type. We're going to talk about one more type before we throw this away, or before this video is over. So we're not allowed to divide by 0. There's another big rule that you might remember, and the big rule is we can't take the square root of a negative number, right? So if, I'm just going to change colors here so we can see that. So if f of x is the square root of x, well, that tells us that the only numbers we can't plug in are the negative ones. So we have to, whoops, this should have been does not equal 7. Oops. The only numbers that we can plug in are the positive ones, right? So we could either say, that x has to be greater than or equal to 0, right? Because we can only plug in the numbers that are bigger, or 0 and bigger, right? Because 0, you can take the square root of that. What about f of x is the square root of x plus 2? Well, for this to be negative, x would have to be less than negative 2. So that means x, the numbers we're allowed to plug in, are all numbers where x is greater than or equal to negative 2. Well, let's just check that. If we plug in negative 2, we'll get 0. Square root of 0 is 0, so that's fine. If we plug in 5, or let's plug in 7. If we plug in 7, the square root of 7 plus 2 is 9. Square root of 9 is 3. We're allowed to do that. But what about negative 3? That's not in this. Negative 3, that would be negative 1 in here. Square root of negative 1, it's an imaginary number, so we're going to say that that does not exist. We're not going to do that. All right, let's do one more, and then we'll let this go. So I've reversed it for you, right? I'm saying 3 minus x. But again, our job is just to figure out what values are good and what values are bad. So we know 0 is okay in here. And I think most of us can look at this and go, oh, when x equals 3, this whole thing is 0. So that is a good start. But is it the numbers that are bigger than 3, like 5, 11, that 5 or 11 that make this good? Or is it less than 3 that makes it good? So we'll just test it, right? Let's try the number 5. Well, if we plug in the number 5 into this, 3 minus 5 is negative 2. The square root of negative 2, that's no good. So we're thinking that probably the number is less than 3. So let's plug in 0. If we plug in 0, well, that would be the square root of 3, and that's okay. We're allowed to do that. So we know that x has to be less than or equal to the number 3, right? So if you can figure out wherever this function becomes 0, it's either the stuff that are bigger or smaller, and you just plug in a few numbers, check it out, try to figure out what's going on, and then that's the answer. Okay, I hope this helps. Good luck.